Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Meter Cute interviews here on Meter and Mayhem. Today, we'll be talking with George Franklin, whose sixth collection is out now from Sheila na gig Editions. It's called Remote Cities. You can see it right there. His other collections include Noise of the World, also from Sheila na gig, and a collection in collaboration with Colombian poet Jimena Gomez, Conversaciones sobre Agua, Conversations About Water, from Catacana Editores. His work can be found in places such as Soflo Pojo, Rattle, and the Three Penny Review. He received an MFA in poetry from Columbia University and a PhD in English and American Literature from Brandeis University, as well as a JD from University of Miami. He practices law in Miami, teaches poetry workshops in Florida prisons, and co-translated along with the author Jimena Gomez's Ultimo Dia, Last Day. So sit back, relax, and get ready to fall in love.
Hi, thank you, Jen, for inviting me today. I'm going to start off because it's all about metered poetry and different kinds of form, with a pantoum that I did a while back that's in my book, Remote Cities. It's called In Oak and Hickory. And I should give you some background. The way it started was I used to live up in Ossining, New York, and there was some woods down the street from where I was living. And I discovered in the middle of those woods an old abandoned car where the trees had grown up around the car. There used to be streets running through there of some sort, and then they were obviously allowed to go back to forest. In Oak and Hickory. An old Ford abandoned in the woods where I walked my dog and watched for deer. Trees grew around it. It couldn't leave. Names were carved in oak and hickory. When I walked my dog and watched for deer, I could hear leaves stirred by unseen feet. Names carved into oak and hickory. Names carved 30, 40 years before. I could hear leaves stirred by unseen feet, tree limbs shifting to let the light fall. Names carved 30, 40 years before, worn like gravestones or memorials. Tree limbs shifted to let the light fall on the rusted body, collapsed wheels, worn like gravestones or memorials. They would have talked here till late at night, by the rusted body, collapsed wheels, seats with broken springs, the damaged roof. They would have talked here till late at night, frightened by owls, deer breaking cover, on seats with broken springs, damaged roof, just room to stretch out on a blanket, frightened by owls, deer breaking cover. Fears of the dark were eased by whiskey, just room to stretch out on a blanket, their pocket knives dulled by bark and sap, their fears of the dark eased by whiskey. The night grew chilly, the stars brighter, their pocket knives were dulled by bark, sap. Memory is sticky like that too. The night stays chilly, the stars brighter. Wars start in Korea, Vietnam. Memory is sticky like that too. Trees grow around it so it can't leave. Wars start in Korea, Vietnam, and old forts abandoned in the woods. And I thought that I'd do something I almost never do in readings, which is read a bunch of sonnets. The first one is just called Sonnet, and it's a blank verse sonnet. There's something absolute about the past. The Trojan War and last night's birthday dinner are equally out of touch. We fool ourselves that memory makes one close at hand, the other dust and recited story. Candles blown out have disappeared. That word is like a zero, absence. The view from the astronaut's visor, surrounded by black what between the stars. We cover up our loss with words for nothing, and grammar gives us what facts can't. Memories unreal, an epic with a vague beginning, no ending to speak of, lives written badly. I know all this, but it doesn't make a difference. I touch your nightgown folded beneath the pillow. And the next one is a poem about an incident. It's a sonnet about an incident in the lives of Osip Mandelstam and Marina Svetaeva. And they actually, I think they met for the first time physically in Moscow in 1916 when when Mandelstam was persuaded by Svetaeva to come visit there. Um, it is believed that they had a short affair there. Incense and straw. Tonight my leg hurts and my eyes are tired. I read Mandelstam's poem for Svetaeva, Moscow in 1916, the sled they hired careening through dirty snow, chapel of a church with an onion dome, not a white-spired arrow that penetrates heaven, or platonic love, poisonously insipid, weakly desired, not Protestant either, but lit by candles below the altar. Outside, smell of horse-mared, the beast exhaling steam, its crusted hooves knocking against the ice, the driver's black beard rocking along as he snores. Inside, a dove's dry feather against her cheek, prayers unheard. The moon, like ripe garlic, breaks into cloves. And while we're on the subject of sonnets about poets, this one is about Wallace Stevens. And he used to go to lunch apparently once a week at the Canoe Club in Hartford, where he would drink martinis. Lunch in Hart, and also he had his marriage was perhaps less than ideal. Lunch in Hartford. You watch the sky slip sideways like water, the clouds sluicing toward inevitable ocean. Afternoon, the intricate gears of a medieval clock. Martinis are an exercise in precision. The olive's cruel toothpick pointing north toward tundra that's nothing like Connecticut, ice-colored pillowcases, honeymoon sheets. You watch the sky and tell time by the wind. See how it shifts at 2 o'clock, and drink until the sunlight slopes the cut glass pitcher and divides itself to patterns on the table. In place of certainty, ritual, nodding to a waiter you recognize, his jacket spotless as the cool cheek of the woman you cannot kiss. And I thought I would also work in here um, something that I do that people aren't aware of. I don't think too many people are. I have a lot of poems that appear to be free verse that actually, if you look at them, are 9-syllable lines. So I really enjoy doing syllabics. Um, this is one of them. Afternoon in November. I've grown used to disappearing, not being here anymore is me, that sequence of whatever stories I tell myself to create a person. There in each other's arms, stories stop, thought ends, the way it ends in air blue emptiness, the ragged edges of white clouds becoming transparent, leaves shuffled against leaves, invisible wind, buzzards circling hundreds of feet above the ranch-style houses, asphalt driveways, streets that twist back and emerge into the fast flow of traffic south or west toward fields green with tomato vines and strawberries, tangled thorns of bougainvillea, shallow marshes that somewhere become ocean. The buzzards don't see me, sitting by the window, staring up at heavy coconuts clustered together, fronds and tree limbs moving at the same time, some almost imperceptibly. And if I look hard, I won't see myself in any of this either. The tree limbs and sky will still be there, the buzzards too, but I won't exist as an audience. This morning in the kitchen, it was the same. I kissed that spot where your neck and shoulder meet and lost myself in the scent of bath soap and of dark coffee. Thank you.
Wow, George, thank you so much for that reading. I really enjoyed that pantoum especially the way the line, memory is sticky like that too, how it almost gets at one of the, for some reason the word beautiful is coming, like the beautiful things about the form of the pantoum, the way that it can kind of, things kind of,
Weave, yeah.
yeah. There's they stick, they move forward and stay in place at the same time, and that, I think that stickiness, I think that line just really got to that. So that was, I loved that. Can you tell me about a poet that you love?
Okay. Um, well, I have to give you a little background on it. Until I did the Columbia MFA program way back in the early 80s. And until I did that, I was totally committed to free verse. I thought, everything else was, not authentic in some way. And I studied when I was there with Joseph Brodsky. And Brodsky um, had us memorize, everybody in the seminar had to memorize every week a poem that he would assign. And it was usually by Frost or Hardy or Auden. Sometimes somebody else, Wilfred Owen or someone else, but they were all formal poems. And he just essentially beat it into us. And I came away loving Frost. And it was incredibly useful for me because several years later, um, my father was dying of cancer, and my mother was suffering from Alzheimer's. And my marriage wasn't all that great either. So there was a sort of perfect storm there. And I walked around for months reciting to myself Frost's poem, Acquainted with the Night. And it was like a mantra for me. And I had to think about why this poem was so important and what Frost did that was hard to find elsewhere. And one of the things I liked about it was that it doesn't console. There's no solutions. It doesn't give you any answers. It doesn't tell you things are going to get better or anything else. What it does is that you see um, that poetry is a way to survive things. He survives the the night that he's acquainted with, and that's what you come away with, that it's survivable. Acquainted with the night. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. And it's a wonderfully contained poem. It's a terza rima sonnet, which is pretty rare in English. I really don't know of many others. And it's quite wonderful. So that's my Frost sort of kept me sane during that time. I also love the fact that he was committed to story in poetry.
Is there a particular poem of his that you feel that the other than this one, one that has a more specific narrative that reaches out to you?
Oh gosh, there's so many of them. I mean, even something, well, um, even something like The Hired Man is great. I mean, these poems we take for granted because we've seen them in so many anthologies and heard them as kids, and just we forget about how absolutely magnificent they are.
Yeah, I wasn't I mean, I was acquainted with Frost, but not like fully until I took a class during my PhD program and had just a whole new take on him. Um, it's almost like um, I have to apologize ahead of time because I know that one of my high school English teachers follows me and follows the channel. So if she does happen to see this apologies ahead of time. But like what I learned was that like half of the readings that people had done on Frost poems and that had just sort of assumed what certain poems meant were like completely wrong. That he was so much more complex than what I had previously been taught in like high school and sort of colloquially out in the culture.
He's amazing. I mean, his blank verse is just incredible. And, all, um, you see that in all the narratives. Um, and I mean, just in the poem that I read, Acquainted with the Night, um, just to use the terza rima echoes Dante. And so it's sort of a inferno compressed. Yeah, no, I mean, Auden has this line about Sigmund Freud that, he assumed this kind of protective coloration. And I think that really applies to Frost. I mean, Frost wanted to be able to make a living at poetry. And, he figured out how to do it, but it involved sort of a lot of self-denial. And it did take Randall Jarrell coming around years later, writing about Frost that, and when somebody asked Frost about the way that Lionel Trilling and Randall Jarrell had been writing about the darkness in his work, and he said, "Oh, well, it took you long enough to find out about this."
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, and even, I mean, it was probably 2012 when I was became acquainted with the fact that like, half the people in his poems he's actually saying, and that's not a good thing, or like, and that person's an idiot, right? Like what is it, the good fences make good
Oh, yeah,
neighbors, that
yeah.
it's like he's saying that that's like stupid.
Well, no, no, there are all these things like that. I mean, two paths diverged in a yellow wood, but they're actually the same. I mean, it says they're exactly the same. There's no difference.
Right. Yeah.
But people love to think it's this great poem about individuality.
Right. And
They just don't read it closely. And he does require being read very closely. I mean, that's the game that he plays.
yeah. Yeah, he requires a lot of you, but seems like it doesn't. And so I think that that tricks a lot of people. They miss
Yeah,
out on a lot.
you see that with there's so many poets that end up in anthologies for children, and you wonder how it ever happened. I mean, it's like, Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market ending up in, children's anthologies. You just say, "Didn't you read it?"
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Or
But that
maybe,
happens.
oh, I was gonna say maybe people just really want children to be acquainted with the darkness. They're like, life is pain, children.
Right. I think that would be an anthology that would be remaindered very quickly.
Probably. You're probably right. You're probably right.
I'd buy a copy. You might buy a copy, but not too many other people.
Yes. So you mentioned that you studied with Brodsky when you were doing your grad program. Um, what advice would you have if you could go back in a time machine and give early 80s George some advice? What kind of advice would you give?
Uh, two things. Two things. One. is I would advise myself to take what you're given and don't make demands on it. For a number of years, I wanted to write in a certain way. I wanted to sound a certain way,
Mm.
and the work didn't come out that way. And so as soon as the poem would start not to be what I wanted, I would just say, "Okay, well, that's that. Move on to something else." And it's very hard to write that way. It just doesn't work. You have to just accept what you're given. If you're starting, if you sit down to write a sonnet and it turns into, a Whitman-esque, free verse, great, take it. Don't assume that, that somehow that's a failure. It's not. Um, and the other thing I think I would tell myself is that, you have a voice no matter what form you're using. The voice is always there. And even though it's very hard to hear yourself, I notice this with my students. I teach in a prison these days, and my students have a hard time hearing their own voices,
Mm.
understanding that they have a voice, that each one has an individual sound. And that I think that's true for young poets in general, that it's just very difficult to hear yourself. So you assume that when you write, you're writing a sonnet, you sound totally different from when you're writing blank verse or free verse or whatever. And it's really not true. I mean, you have a certain set of concerns, certain diction, certain experiences, and those are always going to shape a voice. And it doesn't really matter what form. So that's the advice that I should have what I would have liked to have known at that point.
Do you have any tips or recommendations on ways that you help people hear their voice better? Or how people can hear their own voice better?
Boy, that's a good question. Um, just to read a lot.
Mm.
I mean, I don't know what else to say on that. I mean, it's really hard to hear yourself, to understand that your set of experiences and your choice of words and everything is just going to be different from other people's. And I guess when you try, one thing to do is to try to imitate other poets. And when you can't do it, you're always gonna come out sounding like yourself. It's the failure to imitate that yields a voice in a way. So
Yeah.
maybe that would work. I'm not sure. I mean, I know you know, I was very disturbed that, I didn't sound like Rilke. I really wanted to sound like Rilke. I wanted to sound like Miloš. It didn't happen really. But it's that you've got to have somebody to work off of.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes I have run into people, especially when I used to teach, people saying that they didn't read other poets because they were afraid it would get in the way of their own voice.
Well, I think that's the only way you get a voice. I mean, really, you have to read. If you don't read, you don't. You can start without having read much, but what I always do with my students in prison is every week I give them anywhere from say 3 to 6 poems that I've copied out and copied and brought in, along with the assignment for the next week. And eventually, after they've taken the course for a while, they accumulate quite a few of these poems, and they've read a good range of lyric poetry. I'm limited by the amount I can copy, but otherwise I'd bring them in volumes, but it just can't do that. Um, but I think that's really important. You got to, and if it works, they go out seeking writers themselves to read.
That's great. Are there Are there limits to the poems that you're allowed to bring in? I know that when people have run libraries and things for the incarcerated, there's limits to, is there any poet that you have wanted to bring in and then realized you couldn't bring in?
Um, there are a couple of John Murillo's poems that I hesitated to bring in because I thought, well, if this gets to the administration, I might get into some trouble there.
Yeah.
But I admire his work enormously. And I don't know, I pronounce it Murillo, but it may be Murillo. I don't know. I haven't heard him pronounce it. But anyway, I admire his work a great deal, and I have brought in some, but there are poems of his that I have not brought in for that reason.
Mhm.
Otherwise, not. I mean, just nobody really cares in general. You have to sort of push the envelope a lot to get somebody to care, I think, about that.
Well, I'm glad that gives you a nice broad range with of poems to bring in and to get people to interested in. It's awesome. What advice do you think that a younger you would have for you now?
Be absolutely grateful for the huge amount of resources that are out there now. If you go back in 1970s and 1980s, you had little magazines. And what you did was, this sounds like I'm talking about before the invention of the car or the, light bulb or something. But, you had to send out everything by mail with the stamped self-addressed envelope in there and your nicely typed little, cover letter. And Carolyn Forche told a workshop I was in once, had to make sure that you've got the outside of the envelope typed, not handwritten, so they won't, that affects how that goes into the slush pile. Um,
Really?
yeah.
No one I was submitting when things were still by mail too, and I never realized that. I probably would have typed them had I realized that. I always hand wrote them.
I worked as an editorial assistant for the Parish Review back in the 80s, and there was a room that was the slush pile, and it really was a room, and it was filled with stacks of submissions, and we would just take a big stack of them home with us. That's what everybody would do, and read through them and make notes, and absolutely nothing that I passed on was ever taken for the magazine. So I don't know what to make of that. Um,
Well, well, how
but
much from the slush pile
that
was
was,
getting
but
in?
I mean, now there's so many journals to get published in, so many places you can submit, so many competitions.
Yeah.
It's huge. And it gives people a lot more resources to work with. And just the amount of poems that are online to read, the anthologies that are online, all the collections that are online. It's amazing. I mean, none of that was there then. So I think my younger self would tell me to, not to complain if I get a rejection from someplace, that I've got a lot more to apply for, and it's a heck of a lot easier than it was for that younger self.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and cheaper. I mean, I know that we talk about there's lots of conversations online about submission fees and things, but um when you're sending stuff out, you could put a lot into postage and envelopes and all that that went out.
And simultaneous submissions were considered to be the devil. You know, it was it seems crazy to me now, the idea of somebody sitting there waiting 6 months, to hear.
Yeah. And I knew somebody that got banned from the Georgia Review once because she had simultaneously submitted and they wanted to pick up the poem and she had to tell them no because somebody else had picked that one up and they were kind of done with her.
That's the way it was.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that my younger self would just tell me to, shut up, stop complaining.
Yeah. Yeah, but then if your younger self saw some of the conversations that go on social media, what do you what do you think he would say?
I think he would probably get in the middle of it, put his foot in, put this misstep, make tons of missteps and, say outrageous things and regret it 5 minutes later, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, that's different too. I mean, the whole social media, world is just quite different from back when I started doing this. There was nothing like it, nothing at all.
Now, because have you had 6 collections?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of them's a chapbook, and one of them was done in collaboration with Jimena Gomez. Um,
When did the
but yeah,
first one come
6
out? Was
total.
that after social media was like, did you have to promote your first one with social media, or were you
Oh, I had
pre?
to pronounce. What happened with me is that I mean, I really quit making any attempt to publish for many, many years. I was working as an attorney full time, and that took up most of my time. And I had kids to get through college and that sort of thing. So I started again back in 2017,
Okay.
and 2000, I guess, started sending things out again in 2016, and really got into the swing of it and figured it all out in terms of what I needed to do in 2000 and by 2016, 2017, I guess. And so that's when um, I won the Sheila Nagig competition, and they published my first book, and then Haley's Mitchell Hogan at Sheila has published 2 other books of mine subsequently. And as luck would have it, down here I met Omar Villasana, um, who runs Katakana Editores. And he did a book of mine that Jimena, it was a dual language book that Jimena translated. Um, and um, he also published the collaboration that we did.
That's excellent. And it says a lot about your work that a press wants to continue publishing it, that you have presses um that appreciate and support your work.
Well, I'm very grateful for them. I really am. I mean, there's no, I've been incredibly lucky with the editors. I just have never had those horrible experiences that other people talk about. So I'm just, I have had, both Haley and Omar are amazing people who just continue to take the books around to play, years later, they've got the books there, at a book fair. We've gone down twice with Omar to Mexico City to do the big book fair down there at the Palace of Mining. And we went once on our own to give a reading at the Jewish Book Fair in Mexico City also. So I mean, there's been a lot of work publicizing, and he's been very supportive.
Those are great stories to hear, because you hear so speaking of social media again, social media is just full of people talking about all their horror stories, and it's lovely to hear that there are good editors out there who are easy to work with and supportive.
I mean, I'm sure I've been very lucky, but these are both terrific people. They really are. And my chapbook, Travels of the Angel of Sorrow, was published by Michael Poge at Blue Cedar, and he's a wonderful guy. I mean, he really got me to do the chapbook. He wrote to me and said, "Look, what have you got for me for a chapbook?" And said, well, I've got a few poems, I'll work on some more for this. And so it was put together working really with him.
What a nice feeling to have someone solicit work from you instead of having to continually send out. That's lovely.
It does happen. That's what I'm saying. My younger self would tell me just, be grateful and,
Right.
don't complain, don't gripe.
Right.
You've got it easy.
Ah, that's good. That's a good thing to remember sometimes, I think. Well, George, it's been lovely getting to talk to you this afternoon. Um, thank, thanks for coming and telling me all the great stories and reminding me how wonderfully complex frost is.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking me.
What a fun interview that was. I feel like I just want to go out and read a bunch of Robert Frost now just to revel in his complexities. Oh, thanks for stopping by.